Day 4. Linguist and thinker Dr. Samuel Johnson once said, "Patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel," as a warning to not seek simple solutions to complex problems. Sci-fi author Isaac Asimov later paraphrased it as, "Violence is the last refuge of the incompetent." But today, on the 19th of October 1962, President Kennedy receives very competent advice as to why violence should be the simplest and most patriotic response to the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'm Indy Neidell. This is TimeGhost with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yesterday, U.S. President John F. Kennedy leaned towards not going to war with Cuba, but declaring a blockade instead, and Defense Secretary Robert McNamara had seemed to get some support from the military for that idea. Today, the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the U.S. Armed Forces try hard to sway Kennedy back to the path of military action. On Cuba, there were many more Russians than U.S. intelligence presumed, and they were very hard at work readying their missiles for deployment. The CIA had been trying to work out where the Soviet nuclear warheads were stored. Obviously, knowing this was the prerequisite to the U.S. Air Force taking them out with targeted strikes, and would significantly increase the appeal of a limited airstrike as a solution. One location they had been observing for months as a possible nuclear depot was a bunker complex near the municipality of Bejucal, about a 45-minute drive south of Havana. But they had now discarded this as a possible option since they couldn't see any recent improvements to the facility. It wasn't very well guarded and was only protected by a simple chain-link fence. Bejucal surrounds a small township founded in 1831. Other than being the terminal station of Cuba's first railroad and hosting a very popular carnival festival, it's a fairly insignificant place. On a random side note, actor Andy Garcia was born there 6 years before the crisis, but he and his family had fled to the U.S. last year. Anyhow, the CIA were very much mistaken. This is where the warheads were in fact stored. In a modified hillside bunker complex, there were now 160 Russian nuclear warheads being prepared so they could be mounted on missiles and armed. A veteran of the Soviet nuclear armed forces, Colonel Sergei Romanov, is in charge of the operation. Now, the working conditions are abysmal. In Cuba, the warm and humid tropical climate makes it difficult to maintain the right conditions for what is a very sensitive and very dangerous job. Romanov scrounges whatever air conditioners his Cuban hosts can lay hands on, and finally resorts to requisitioning loads and loads of boxes of ice to cool the inside of the bunker. Much worse still is the invisible and imperceptible radiation. Many of the workers will develop cancer and will die from radioactive exposure over the coming months and years. Then there's the stress of maybe being discovered and bombed by the U.S. There is hardly any time or peace of mind to sleep. The strain is already taking its toll on Romanov's health, and he will die of a heart attack shortly after returning to Russia. His second-in-command, Major Boris Boltenko, also a nuclear force veteran, is even now suffering from undiagnosed brain cancer from prolonged exposure and will also die in a few months. Today, they are finally getting rid of at least some of the warheads. The first batch of the gadgets, as they call them, is now ready to be shipped to the missile sites. The chosen destination is the most remote missile location in the center of the island. Unit Commander Colonel Sidorov has made progress there far more quickly than expected with preparations of the rockets. Sidorov's unit is also the best concealed and most difficult to strike from the air. The warheads are loaded on a convoy of 20 trucks that will travel 14 hours by night on almost impossibly primitive jungle roads. To avoid detection, the trucks use no headlights, and only every fourth one has side lights to allow the convoy to stay on the road. Meanwhile, Sidorov is finalizing preparations so the first warheads could be mounted already tomorrow. The Soviet forces will then only need a 30-minute window to arm and launch the missiles. In the White House, the assumption, or should we say hope, is that this window is 18 hours, which would allow the U.S. to act without the danger of immediate nuclear retaliation. Though as of today, the U.S. does correctly assume the total Cuban nuclear arsenal, including ICBMs, will be deployable sometime in the next 2 months. At 9:45 a.m., President Kennedy receives the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the U.S. Armed Forces. The chiefs still want to convince him to make a military strike, as I said before. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Taylor, says,
"From the outset, I would say that we felt we were not united on the military requirement here. That we could not accept Cuba as a missile base. That we should either eliminate or neutralize the missiles there and prevent any others coming in. Well, from a military point of view, that meant three things. First, attack with the benefit of surprise those known missiles and offensive weapons that we knew about. Secondly, continued surveillance then to see what the effect would be. And third, a blockade to prevent the others from coming in. I would say, again, from a military point of view, that seemed clear. We were united on that."
He goes on to say that they are not unanimous regarding invasion and want political action to also take in parallel. Kennedy replies,
"Let me just say a little first about what the problem is from this point, my point of view. First, I think we ought to think of why the Russians did this. Well, actually, it was a rather dangerous but rather useful play of theirs. If we do nothing, they have a missile base there with all the pressure that brings to bear in the United States and damage to our prestige. If we attack Cuba, missiles or Cuba in any way, it gives them a clear line to take Berlin, as they were able to do Hungary under the Anglo war in Egypt. We will have been regarded as, they should get a fixation about Cuba anyway, we will be regarded as the trigger-happy Americans who lost Berlin. We would have no support among our allies.
Kennedy goes on to weigh the options at hand, explaining why he might prefer a blockade, but he also says,
On the other hand, we got to do something, because to do nothing, we're going to have the problem in Berlin anyway. It's been very clear last night. We're going to have this thing stuck right in our guts in about 2 months. And so we got to do something now.
He then outlines all of the difficulties that they're presented with on a diplomatic level if they should attack Cuba, especially regarding Berlin. Then Taylor says,
We recognize all these things, Mr. President, but I think we'd all be unanimous in saying that really our strength in Berlin, our strength any place in the world, is the credibility of our response under certain conditions. And if we don't respond here in Cuba, we think the credibility of our response in Berlin.
That's right. So that's why we got to respond. Now the question is, when we got to respond.
General Curtis LeMay, Chief of the U.S. Air Force, now voices his views.
Well, I certainly agree with everything General Taylor has said, and emphasize a little strongly, perhaps, that we don't have any choice except direct military action. If we do this blockade that's proposed and political action, the first thing that's going to happen is your missiles are going to disappear into the woods, particularly your mobile ones.
Admiral George W. Anderson, Chief of Naval Operations, explains that he could carry out the blockade, and it would be easier to enforce complete blockade than partial, but
If we institute a complete blockade, we are immediately having a confrontation with the Soviet Union because it's the Soviet block ships which are taking the material to Cuba.
so he too thinks decisive, preemptive military action is preferable. General and Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, Earl Bus Wheeler, wants his forces to join in with boots on the ground.
Mr. President, in my judgment, from a military point of view, the lowest risk course of action, if we're thinking of protecting the people of the United States against a possible strike on us, is to go ahead with a surprise airstrike, the blockade, and an invasion.
The conversation gets testier. LeMay says,
I think that a blockade and political talk would be considered by a lot of our friends and neutrals as being a pretty weak response to this, and I'm sure a lot of our own citizens would feel that way too. In other words, you're in a pretty bad fix at the present time.
We say?
You're in a pretty bad fix.
You're in with me.
With regard
they debate how certain they can be of Soviet missiles being ready, and when and how to deal with fallout against the U.S. base on Cuba, Guantanamo. The conversation moves more and more towards the practicalities of military action until finally they start looking at dates. It's concluded that the military can be ready to begin a blockade and do airstrikes the day after tomorrow, on Sunday, October 21st. To really get it right, though, they'd prefer Tuesday the 23rd. Then there's the question of invasion.
And now the invasion would take 7 or 8 after the airstrike. Next year, it's going to be going on for about 11 days.
Obviously, Taylor does not know about the tens of thousands of Soviet forces armed with tactical nuclear weapons that are awaiting them on Cuba. No matter what, the Joint Chiefs of Staff are anxious to move ahead, but Kennedy still isn't sure to even respond at all. Wheeler asks,
Dave, am I clear that you addressing yourself as to whether anything at all should be done, but that if military action is to be taken, you agree with it? My question
They sum up the meeting and conclude that for all eventualities, they will continue preparing the military options. Kennedy leaves for his waiting helicopter. Not knowing that they're still being recorded, the chiefs wait until they think the coast is clear and then air their frustration about not being able to decisively move ahead. Expressing an astonishing amount of wishful thinking, they interpret the president's non-committal statements as a discreet way of telling them they should move ahead, at least with airstrikes to take out the missiles. Even General David M. Schopp of the U.S. Marines, who is the only military man there opposed to an invasion, feels they have Kennedy's unspoken support for airstrikes, while acknowledging that no matter what you do in this situation, you're screwed.
Somebody can keep them from doing the goddamn thing piecemeal. That's our problem. Going in freaking around with a missile, you're screwed. You go in freaking around a little else, you're screwed. That's right. You're screwed. And if some goddamn thing, some way, you can say either do the son of a bitch and do it right, and quit frigging around. That was my people. Don't frig around and go take a missile out.
In fact, Kennedy is not at all convinced of any military action, and still the preparations go ahead. As we've said before, when you let out the slack on the leash of the dogs of war, there's a real risk they might slip out of your hand. By the time Kennedy lands for campaign rallies in Ohio, the world has taken yet another few steps towards nuclear war. We'll see you on day 5 as Kennedy tries to unring the bells that he inadvertently rung today. If you've just joined us, you can see the first regular episode, day 0, right here. Do not forget to subscribe, and please support us on Patreon so we can make more awesome history. Links are below. Good night and good luck.